Yippee-ki-yay! This is Professor Tatum here with another lecture for History 1302, taking you out to the Western Plains, looking at the American West, once again, late 1800s, early 1900s, now looking at incorporation and domestic imperialism in the Western frontier. As usual, we will start with a good bit of context. Within that context, we will examine common perceptions people seem to have about the Wild West in this period. Then we'll look at some realities of the West. Then we'll examine this idea of domestic imperialism and how we can largely see it playing out through conflicts known as the Indian Wars on the Western Plains. Then we'll look at some nonviolent measures of incorporating indigenous Americans into the US, which largely involves a good deal of cultural extermination. And then we'll also see that there were some nonviolent measures of resistance, which included both legal and spiritual resistance. We'll also look at the consequences of each of those. So, normally, if we were having this class face to face, I would ask everybody to get in groups and talk with your group mates about what comes to your mind when you think of the West in the 1800s, right? The late 1800s, that is, after the Civil War. This is the Wild West, the era of gunslingers, cowboys, and railroads. And those are all things people draw, right? Give you tumbleweeds, railroads, big six shooters. And those, by the way, are all relevant in some form or another to this post Civil War period of the West. Then, however, we start seeing other things that are strangely not closely related. Right? We see the Alamo pop up, maybe Davy Crockett, or the Gold Rush. And while these things all did happen in some location of what could be considered the West, these all occurred before the Civil War, right? We're seeing different things happening across different spans of time. And even if we look, for example, say at the Alamo versus the Gold Rush, that's Texas and California, very far away from each other, very different regions geographically, and very different things going on at each place and each time. So, what are these connections we're drawing here that are giving us this vision of the West, of swinging door saloons and gunslingers? Uh, they all seem to kind of encompass this idea of individuals who are real rugged and tough, and they don't need nobody to show them how to do it. They're picking themselves up by the bootstraps and figuring out as they go. And if they've got to take some very heroic falls in the process, like the men at the Alamo did, or at Custer's last stand, they are willing to do so in a great blaze of glory. Where do we get this vision of the West, all right, that really kind of blurs together all kinds of things that are maybe very, very loosely related, but don't really have a whole lot in common if we break it down? Where does this come from? What are the origins of this vision of the West that seems to loom in popular imagination? It kind of fascinates me that when I have my class do this, they can pretty easily talk to each other and they have fun just drawing things, and they're not sitting there trying to look up on ChatGPT, what should I be doing right now? Right? We have this vision of the West that just kind of lingers in our mind. Why is that? If I ask you to draw some other period in history, it's very likely you'd need to Google a little bit to really have an idea of what it looked like. Well, I'd say this largely comes from pop culture, starting early on with things like dime novels. And then these were later, of course, in many cases, inspirations for Western films. Also, a great deal of tall tales passed down by oral tradition. But a great deal of even the vision of the West portrayed in these dime novels and films and tall tales are based on a vision of the West created by an individual named William Buffalo Bill Cody. All right, I believe you saw him in one of your videos for the reading video quiz for this week. And he had this phenomenon that he put on this great experience of a performance, which he called the Wild West Show. Best way I can think to describe this was a mix between a circus and a rodeo. All right, he would travel from town to town, put on this great outdoor performance where he'd have men on horseback reenacting battles, having big cattle drives. He'd bring real indigenous peoples in from the plains to tell an altered version of their story and sell the idea of what it meant to be an Indian. And the thing about these stories in the Wild West shows, they were all intended to be based on Buffalo Bill's real life experiences that he witnessed out on the West as a buffalo hunter, and during the brief time that he served in the Indian Wars. Well, we now know in hindsight that a lot of what he portrayed about himself and his experiences in the West in the show was clear exaggeration. He not only clearly blended a lot of uh, other frontiersmen's experiences and stories that he heard about them into his own life story, there were just a lot of things that he just kind of blew out of proportion to sell this great story and make it very phenomenal and entertaining. And as far as we can tell, the public was pretty well aware of this and they were okay with it because it kind of confirmed some of their biases and it told them the story they wanted to hear. All right, it kind of showed them the vision of the West that they wanted to believe was real. And it was very entertaining and it brought a sense of culture and a sense of pride in what it meant to be an American, picking yourselves up by the bootstraps. As we'll see moving forward, a lot of those ideals that drove the Wild West show and future visions of the West are perhaps a bit oversimplified. Now, a lot of the things that you see in terms of there being cowboys, gunslingers, cattle drives, etc., are very legitimately part of the post Civil War West. Whereas some of those things, like it all being this rugged individualism and picking yourselves up by the bootstraps, may be a bit oversimplified. Okay. Another common source of the American idea of what the West is and what it means comes actually from a historian, right, named Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner had a thesis titled The Significance of the Frontier on American History. I'm going to really break this down into simple terms. American history basically started in the East and gradually expanded out into the West, all right? And this is kind of the idea, kind of the version, the narrative, we could say, of American history that I'd imagine most of you, if not all of you, probably learned in earlier levels of education. It all started at Plymouth and Jamestown. These English colonists eventually had a revolution for a great honorable cause because they wanted freedom and liberty for all, and they gradually expanded their vision and their dreams of freedom westward. And they brought that civilization with them and helped civilize and tame the West. And this was all part of this great vision of manifest destiny, this God given vision. We'll come back to that in a little bit here. But he has a very clear division between this kind of civilized Eastern urban society and this untamed, savage wilderness West, okay? And what he's suggesting really here is that as Americans are moving westward, they are continuously meeting this area which he refers to as the frontier. Okay, the frontier is where the East meets the West, according to Turner here. And it's where, in his eyes, civilization meets that savage wilderness. And he suggests that all of the key moments in American history have really played out in this frontier. And the defining individuals and defining episodes of American history have all been born there in the frontier, wherever it might be at any point in American history. So that really defines a lot of ideas that have carried on both in historical narratives and in public imagination about the West as this kind of wild place where civilization meets wilderness, right? Like many contemporary historians, I'm going to give a good bit of pushback to Turner's thesis. Not only does it oversimplify things, but it creates a very kind of Anglo-American centric lens by suggesting that American history starts in the East, suggests that the start of American history starts with British colonists. And that leaves out not only the several other European colonists throughout the Americas, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French. Hell, even the Russians had a small presence in early America. The Portuguese down in South America. Those are all part of American history, okay? And by suggesting that American history only starts with the British in the East, suggests that none of those people's histories are relevant to American history. And that's just pure and total poppycock, all right? Furthermore, it leaves out the experiences of the various civilizations and nations of indigenous peoples throughout the Americas who have populated the continents and had their own histories playing out for centuries long before any Europeans, including those who settled out in the East, showed up. And this altogether just creates a very narrow, oversimplified Anglo-American centric lens that I'd like us to try to break beyond as we look into the West. Okay, so let's look at some realities of the West. Again, as we'll see, a lot of our common perception of the West, things that students typically draw on that activity I usually do in face-to-face classes, are accurate. Right? We'll see things like cowboys, cattle drives, conflicts with Native Americans, etc. but a lot of the way they all tie together, perhaps an oversimplification, largely as a result of our understanding and the way it's been warped by Buffalo Bill's legacy, as well as the legacy of Turner's frontier thesis. First of all, as we continue this lecture into the West, I want us to remember how this fits in with our bigger theme of Unit 1 of understanding the Civil War as a sort of second American Revolution, and understanding that there's a modern nation being constructed in this period after the Civil War, from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, right? Late 19th century into the early 20th century, that is. So the incorporation of the West, as the U.S. is expanding out into the Western Plains, claiming territory and incorporating indigenous societies into the U.S. and putting it all into the U.S.'s domain, we need to remember that this is all part of this bigger reconstruction of the nation, and the way this all plays out will say something about the new modern nation that is forming. First thing I want to really kind of complicate is the division of East and West, as is really kind of a legacy of Turner's thesis that there is this civilized industrial East, which is separate from the rural, primarily agricultural West. And that's quite an oversimplification because they're closely interlinked. They're almost symbiotic to one another. As you saw in the Homestead Act video for your lecture activity, factories in the East were sending tools and supplies to farmers out West, and the farmers out West were in turn sending food back to the people in the East. And all the connection here was made possible by industrial railroads, which were expanding largely out into the West. All right. So we need to keep in mind there's a strong connection between the big industrial boom occurring in the East that we'll be looking at a little more as we move forward, and what's going on here in the West. So I also would like us to explore some realities of cowboys. So cowboys are usually kind of top of the list when I have students identify what comes to their mind about the Wild West in the late 1800s. Yet there's a bit of confusion about cowboys, all right? So I just want to clear up some realities here. First of all, understanding what a cowboy was. A lot of people think of cowboys as a kind of a rugged gunslinger, right? Whether it's a bounty hunter or an outlaw, bandito, not necessarily, okay? All it meant to be a cowboy was to be a cattle herder driving cattle, okay? A person who made a profit from driving cattle. That was their livelihood. And in some cases, sure, I'm sure there were some cowboys who were gunslingers. There were probably gunslingers who were cowboys, all right? But being a cowboy was not in any way synonymous with being a gunslinger, all right? It simply meant you're a person who herds cattle. Now, it's also important to point out there were a lot of Black and Mexican cowboys. This is something that has been a little more accurately presented in more recent media. Red Dead Redemption, for example, great game, gives a pretty good portrayal of the West. Of course, some of it gets a bit carried away, but that's what makes the game fun, right? But they have characters like Charles and Lenny, definitely showing that there were a great deal of Mexican and Black cowboys. But for decades, cowboys were presented as John Wayne or the Marlboro Man, these nice, clean cut white guys. And so, while we're on this note of Mexican cowboys, known primarily as vaqueros, sometimes arrieros, also sometimes as charros, where we get charro beans from, I want to point out that Mexican and Mexican American influence has been very heavy on American Western culture, okay? Meaning that a lot of what we identify as American Western culture is rooted in Mexican and Mexican American culture. All right, I'll just point out a couple examples here. That word vaquero for a Mexican cowboy eventually got translated into the word buckaroo, which is, of course, a slang term for an up-and-coming or a young cowhand. Arriero got translated into the word ariat, not quite as commonly used anymore, but that was another Western American term for a cowboy. Also, if we think of popular Western food, things like barbecue, all right, what is barbecue? It's a slow roasted meat cooked over coals, traditionally outdoors. That comes from barbacoa. What is barbacoa? Well, it's the slow roasted head of an animal, usually a cow where we're from. Depending on where you're at, it may be the head of a pig or a goat or God knows what. But some kind of head of an animal, slow roasted over coals, outdoors. Isn't that strange? It's the same process, and they get the same translation there between barbacoa and barbecue. Those are just a couple little examples of different ways that Mexican American culture have had tremendous influence on American Western culture, especially here in the Southwest. Okay. Another important reality of cowboys is we need to understand that the real boom of cowboys, as we know them, as they're presented in popular culture, came in this post-Civil War period. Sure, there had been some ranch hands and things like that before who maybe had some types of similar characteristics, but the true cowboy had a very short span of existence in the late 1800s, kind of died off by the turn of the century. And the reason they were so prominent in this period is because we need to consider what they were doing with these cattle. They were driving them to railroad stations or to railroad cars so that they could be shipped off to factories in the east and slaughtered for their hides and for their meat. Again, that shows us that very clear interconnection there and that symbiotic dependence between the industrial urban East and the rural agricultural West. All right, another reality we need to clear up is breaking this myth of manifest destiny. So it's clear, based on records, that this term manifest destiny was used in the late 1800s, but it's been used a lot more in hindsight as kind of a justification and explanation for a lot of the ways that history played out. It fits very well with Turner's thesis, kind of suggesting that it was some destined move for Americans to expand their culture from east out into the west. So, manifest destiny, of course, I'm sure we've all heard at some point, refers to this idea of there being some God given destiny for the United States to expand from sea to shining sea, to expand its empire and its influence out into the savage wilderness west here. You can see the west out here is dark, and here is the Lady Liberty bringing her great light out into the savage west. All right. And this has been used to explain American history and explain Western expansion in future generations. However, as we'll see, most people who were actually moving out into the West, whether it was railroad companies or homesteaders, were not interested in any kind of idea of having some kind of God given vision. Some of them, maybe in hindsight, use that to justify some of the things they had to do or some of the things they had to endure, but really most of them were interested in getting things like a fresh start, a new beginning, or in many cases some kind of economic incentive, right? Hoping that they could start a big farm, make a big profit. Railroad companies, definitely we see coming along out here, they're making a lot of money off of this. So I think a better way to frame this is domestic imperialism. Imperialism, we'll get a bit more into moving forward, but it essentially means one nation or society forcefully expanding its influence onto other nations or societies. And domestic, of course, means within the confines of a certain region, right? So here at home. In this same period around the world, European empires and the Japanese empire were expanding around the world, carving up influence in parts of Africa and Asia, establishing colonies in those regions. And the US largely stayed out of that. The US really not get involved in any kind of large scale imperialism globally until the very final years of the 1800s. But that's not to say they weren't practicing their own form of imperialism. They were just doing so within the confines of the West and this region that they'd already claimed for quite some time, but not really done much with. To me, using the lens of domestic imperialism to look at this moment in history really much better helps explain things like the Indian Wars and the incorporation of indigenous peoples into American society. All of that definitely demonstrates some type of imperialism at play. All right, so using this lens, we can see that the people moving out into the West on the ground were in a way colonizing the West. Why were they doing this? All right, why were people moving out into the West? Again, it wasn't necessarily being driven by any kind of God given vision or duty. In many cases, common people were enticed by railroad advertisements. For example, a lot of people were hesitant originally to move out west because the weather was not great and the environment was not great for farming. But railroad companies started promising people, oh, we've had some scientists, quote unquote, go out and do some studies. And they realized that the only thing keeping the rain from falling is a lack of people. If we get enough people moved out to the west, it will change the environment in a way that will increase rainfall and make the land better for farming. So the only thing stopping this from being prime farmland is you. So why don't we get you packed up on a train? I'll get you a discounted ticket and we'll get you out to the west. Right? Other people, of course, were just wanting fresh starts, maybe wanting to escape hardships and pressures that they had faced. There were a lot of African Americans, communities known as exodusters, who had fled the South to escape the pressures of Reconstruction. And of course, as I suggested, economic opportunities were also a big motivator. All right, here's another big kicker here. How were people getting out to the West and what was making it possible? Why is this happening in the time that it is in this post Civil War period? Well, I'm going to really complicate the idea of people picking themselves up by the bootstraps and suggest that a lot of this was made possible by government assistance. Nah, please don't misunderstand me and think that I'm suggesting that homesteaders and people moving out west did not work very hard. Many of them absolutely did, and I do not want to diminish that by any means. All I'm simply saying is they did receive a lot of support along the way, and there's really nothing wrong with that. First of all, of course, the Homestead Act, we saw that the federal government was giving away extensive grants of land to individuals with very little requirements. I never care that you know specific numbers, but sometimes it's nice to have numbers and try to understand what they tell us, okay? Under the Homestead Act, the federal government was granting individuals 160-acre plots of land. All they had to do was agree to build a little something or farm on it, do something to improve it in some way, and pay taxes on it moving forward. Well, to put that into perspective here, I grew up on a half-acre lot. My friends and I would go play out in the yard. We'd ride our bikes up and down the driveway. We had a big concrete driveway that went out into the back. We picked fruit straight off the trees. We played with the dogs. And man, we just thought we were out in the country living right in the middle of town. And that was on a half acre. The federal government, keep in mind, is granting people 160 full acre plots for simply moving out west and agreeing to do a little something out there. Railroads also played a huge role in this. Definitely, we saw how they were enticing people with advertisements. They're the ones quite literally moving people and their things and their families out into the West. And railroads were also receiving a lot of government assistance. All kinds of grants from the federal government were going toward railroads to promote this Western expansion. Right. So this really kind of complicates, once again, the image of the rugged individual picking himself up by the bootstraps. And perhaps we can use this as an example to maybe not be so hard on ourselves or on others if we ever fall on times where we do need a little temporary assistance to help ourselves along. We don't need to shame ourselves saying, oh, there was a time when people were so much tougher, they did it all for themselves. Well, they actually got a good bit of help too. And as we saw in the Homestead Act video, things didn't really turn out so great for a lot of these people in the long run. And as we'll see moving forward, when things don't turn out so great, they're going to start looking for a little more support. So don't beat yourself up for needing a little help here and there, or anyone else for that matter. All right, so now we're getting to the real core of this lecture. As people began colonizing the West and claiming territories on the West, there were some problems. The West, as I suggested, was not an unpopulated, untamed wilderness, as Turner might suggest. This land was already heavily populated. One thing we need to consider, I'm not going to get too into the context, since we're in a post-Civil War class and the bulk of this happened before the Civil War, but there were large numbers of Mexican Americans living in the Southwest in territory that the United States had annexed from Mexico following the Mexican American War. And while the terms of the treaty that ended the Mexican American War promised the people living in the Southwest that they would be made full-fledged citizens of the United States with the same equal rights and protections, they were always treated as second class, frequently discriminated against. And as people began moving out into the West in this post-Civil War period, many Mexican American families were forced out of their homes. And in many cases, land grants that were legally protected were brought into question. People would make technicalities saying like, well, the U.S. agreed to recognize land grants given by Mexico, but you only have land grants all the way back from Spain, so they're invalid. You never got one from the Mexican government, so get off this property. A lot of trouble for Mexican Americans there. If you're interested in that, let me know. I have a great reading you can look into that gets a little more into that. But what we'll primarily be looking at throughout the rest of this lecture is how this Western expansion impacted indigenous peoples living out in the West, which will definitely, I think, help us understand this concept of domestic imperialism, as well as how indigenous peoples themselves responded to this imperialism and resisted it in different types of ways. Okay, and moving forward, the main question I want us to consider as we go to the next part of this lecture is which form of Native American resistance was the most successful? Okay, and there's no real right answer there. It's something you have to define for yourself. All right, we're going to look at three different types of resistance from indigenous peoples. Okay, we're going to look at violent resistance, legal resistance, and spiritual resistance, as well as the ramifications of each of those. And I want you to be considering taking note, examining the examples that we look at of each, and considering which of those you find to be the most successful. Before we move any further, we need to clear up some things about indigenous people in the 19th century. First of all, I want to throw any idea we have of indigenous peoples living in the West as the antithesis of civilization out the window, all right? I know that's what Turner told us, but it's a total load of balderdash, all right? Indigenous peoples do have extensive agency, all right? These are societies of human beings who are in no way any less civilized than any other individuals. Sure, they have different types of civilizations. Several of the groups we're looking at in the plains were migratory groups who sustain themselves primarily off of hunting and gathering. Also, though, they have extensive trade networks, all right, very vast economies. They also have spiritual beliefs. They live together, wait for it, in civilizations. Even the more migratory warrior groups had civilizations, meaning they were civilized, all right? They had certain practices, rituals they abided by. They had hierarchies in which there were divisions of power among different groups and individuals within their societies, all right? And some of these groups were very, very powerful, all right? These also, and you must understand, are not the same people that the first Europeans met at first contact who have never seen a metal tool or a gun or barely learning how to ride a horse. They're just riding a wild bronco and trying to figure it out. No, right? By this time, just like Europeans and Americans have changed and adapted to their surroundings and become more skilled with certain tools and more advanced in their knowledge in certain ways, so have Native American societies. Okay, they have greatly adapted to the use of things like metal tools and guns. And I would say that groups like the Apaches and Comanches, by this point, were far out mastering Europeans and Americans with their great skill on horseback. So I know it's very common for Native Americans to be portrayed in certain ways. In the 21st century, we don't usually use this kind of language, and it gets painted a little differently usually. But you'll still notice that in most representations of Native Americans and pop culture, and even in a lot of kind of popular history or in public education, there's a lot of portrayal of Native Americans in either one of two ways, depending on what group of people you're looking at what point in time. They're usually portrayed either as helpless savages who are no match for the great, powerful, almighty Euro American civilization, or they are a savage threat to that civilization, who are bloodthirsty warriors just wanting to kill and raid and destroy. And those are both complete oversimplifications. Sure, there are certain technologies that were introduced to the Americas that indigenous peoples had never seen. But again, they quickly adapted and learned how to work those technologies into their traditional ways of life. There were diseases that Native Americans had never been exposed to. And that is the only reason I want us to understand that Native Americans were so susceptible to European diseases early on. Again, this is long before the period we're looking at, but just to clear this up, don't think that there's any kind of weaker immune system or they're not as evolved or they're not as powerful of people in any way, because that is just completely wrong. They simply had not been exposed to the diseases that Europeans had already been suffering through and built immunities to throughout the Dark Ages. So anybody getting exposed to a disease for the first time is going to be extremely vulnerable to it. Let's think back to not so long ago when we all had to shelter in place and put on masks and started using them as political statements instead of their intended purposes and being stupid. I digress. But point I'm getting at here, we need to break any idea that may be ingrained in our minds anywhere from what's been portrayed to us from whether it's pop culture or earlier levels of education or whatever that may have any representation of indigenous peoples as anything lesser than nations and civilizations of human beings. Okay. One last thing I want to clear up in terms of the kind of image of the brutal savage who's a threat to Euro American civilization. I'm not going to deny that groups like the Comanches and the Apaches could be very, very brutal. You did not want to cross them in the wrong way because they would you up no problem. But we need to understand that the very brutal raids they would carry out were never just unwarranted, okay? They were usually in response to things like violated treaties or perceptions that their homeland or some of their people were being threatened, all right? Or in some cases, they were measures to expand their influence, expand their empire so that they would have more of a fair standing against powerful empires who were surrounding them. Now, if you don't think that Europeans and Americans are willing to do some very brutal things, if they feel that a treaty has been violated, or if they feel that their homeland or some members of their civilization are being threatened, or even if they're simply trying to expand their influence to have a little bit of a stronger hand against potential adversaries, you got another thing coming. You wait till we get to some of the later lectures in this class, and you'll see. So let's keep all this in mind as we move forward and look at how U.S. expansion into the West post Civil War both impacts indigenous peoples as well as the varied responses that they provide in turn. Okay, so one major component of domestic imperialism that had a very strong impact on indigenous peoples in the West was a very rapid decline of the American buffalo or bison. Right? And I'd like to clear up, which is it? Bison, buffalo? I know that can get very confusing. So I do want to clarify. They actually are two different animals, okay? What is commonly referred to as the American buffalo is actually the bison. Obviously, he has more of a beard like Professor Tatum. He has kind of shorter horns, brownish fur, real woolly type fur. Whereas a buffalo from different parts of the world, much darker fur, not nearly as matted or woolly as this one here, much longer curved horns, very clearly different animals. All right. Now, it's most likely a matter of translation that led to these two different types of animals getting referred to by the same name. Now, I'm not going to be nitpicky and say, you called it a bison, it's actually a buffalo, or anything like that. This is commonly referred to as a buffalo. We can call it a buffalo. That's totally fine. Just for the sake of knowing, I wanted you to see the difference here. So, how this fed into the Indian War is we need to understand that bison were key to several of the nations out of the plains. Okay, groups like the Kiowa and Comanches and Lakota Sioux. They use them for all kinds of things, ranging from tools to food. They could also use different parts of the bison for commodities. In some cases they did, as you'll commonly hear, eat all parts of it. All right, they made tripas, lengua, barbacoa, all that good stuff. But in some cases, they did just take certain parts of the bison and use them as commodities. Not nearly to the extent as we'll see American traders doing in a minute here. But overall, many of these plains groups had a spiritual connection, they believed, to many of the bison. All right. So in the video you reviewed for this week, there was a brief excerpt from an older Kiowa woman named Old Lady Horse. And she described the relationship between the Kiowa and the bison as kind of this symbiotic protection. All right. She'd say that the Kiowa loved the bison and the bison loved the Kiowa, and that, or the buffaloes, the word she used. But she referred to how they would go and tear up settlers' gardens and they would block railroad tracks to help protect the Kiowas from American expansion. And this all ties into this idea of when the Plains people would die, their bodies would be returned to the earth, and the bison would eat from the earth. And then the next generation of Plains people would, of course, hunt and eat the bison. And there was just this kind of interconnection there they felt on a spiritual level. So we need to understand what caused this rapid decline of bison in the late 1800s. Now, you'll always hear me say history is not just black and white, not just point A to point B. It is complex. It is complicated. There were several factors at play here, okay? There were some ecological factors. There was a lot of extreme weather changes, mass freezes followed by serious drought, things like that. Definitely also another major factor in recognizing the humanity of these plains nations. We need to recognize their part in this as well. And groups like the Comanches, as they continued to grow in their power, had very large horse herds. And as their horse herds grew, they posed more and more competition with the American buffalo here for grazing space because they needed so much grass to roam on and to eat. But the by far biggest factor at play in what made this decline of the bison occur so rapidly was very clearly the results of things like this. American industrialization, expanding out into the West. Railroads played a key role in the decline of the bison, not only killing them to expand their tracks out westward, but also many times railroad companies would take excursions out into the West and take people out on trains and stop the train out in the middle of the plains and literally let people just jump on the roofs or jump out of the trains for a few minutes and shoot at the bison and then jump back on and take off, all right, and just leave them there to rot. They were also very much used for commercial purposes. People would want things like hides and skulls to sell back in the East to show, oh, this is a product of the West. This is a symbol of the frontier. And sometimes when I review this in class, students look all shocked and they're like, God, why would people do that? We still do this kind of shit, all right? Go to, what is that restaurant I did the other night? Texas Roadhouse. Got all kinds of shit up on the wall. You go to HEB, you'll find all kinds of animal hide rugs. It's nothing that we've grown past by any means. But this was happening in very large numbers to bison, and it does not seem to be really coincidental. All right, certain companies, and in some cases, even representatives of the military or U.S. government, were promoting this mass hunting of bison. We know that that was a vital source, once again, to the way of life of these plains people. This is very clearly an element of that domestic imperialism. And there was a great deal of resentment growing among individuals within several of the indigenous nations out in the West in response to this rapid decline of the buffalo that was largely caused by American industrialization, expansion, and mass hunting. Another key component of domestic imperialism that also fed into this resentment was the reservation system. So, this was a dominant American Indian policy by the end of the Civil War, and the goal through this reservation system was to concentrate these indigenous nations into very confined spaces. This served a few purposes. Number one, it kept them in spaces where the federal government could keep a close watch on them and monitor them and kind of control their lifestyles in many ways. But it also forced them to gradually give up that migratory lifestyle and gradually adopt more sedentary type lifestyles that were more acceptable in the eyes of what this new modern America being constructed after the Civil War would like to see. It was also very much just a power play in the sense that it made these groups now living on these reservations in a way subjects to the U.S. government and made them dependent on the U.S. government. These reservations were frequently established under very sketchy circumstances. Agents of the federal government would convince certain members of a band of a certain nation that it was in their best interest to move on to a reservation in a very threatening way, kind of convince them that, hey, there are American settlers moving out west, whether you want them to or not. And it is inevitable that they will overwhelm you, all right? They're armed to the teeth, they're greedy, and they will kill you and your children. Do you really want that? Do you want to put your children's life at risk? Or would you rather move to a reservation where we understand things are tough for you there? We can go ahead and bring you some set amount of food and supplies over time and take care of you. Doesn't that sound better than constantly being at risk? And they'd kind of coerce certain groups of people to agree to this. And the deal usually was something along those lines. In exchange, they were given a set amount of food or supplies or both over a set amount of time. But what typically happened is the amount that was promised fell short. In a lot of cases, the Indian agents who were responsible for supplying that food and rations would have a lot of it fall off the back of his wagon, and then he'd end up having a little extra money in his pocket, and somebody in town would have whatever supplies were lost. Isn't that strange? All right, so let's kind of put this all into perspective and think of how this would look, perhaps in our personal lives. All right, so say I call one of you into emergency office hours. I tell you, you really, really need to meet with me if you want any chance at making it through this class. All right, and we meet up. And I convince you, look, things are really not going well for you. You are inevitably going to fail this class because the almighty power of my class is just too much for you and it is about to inevitably overwhelm you. Now, I don't want to see you fail. I don't want to see you suffer. So let me make a deal with you. I have put together this test for you that has 10 essay questions and 30 ID terms, and you'd need to complete it within, let's say, 3 hours, okay? And you think about this, you're like, well, God, that sounds like a real pain in the ass. I don't really want to take that kind of test. But let's think here. If I don't, I fail, then that could really mess with my financial aid. That could set off my entire degree plan. And you eventually agree, okay, maybe it is in my best interest to just take this pain in the ass test instead of failing, which it sounds like is going to inevitably happen if I don't agree to take this test. All right. So I say, okay, I'm very glad you made this smart decision here. You won't regret this. I just need you to sign this form here showing me that you've agreed to it. Don't worry about the fine print. I'll take care of all that. Just stuff the university makes me throw in there. Just go ahead and sign here showing me that you agree. So you go ahead and sign it. All right. Then I get on to here the next day. I get on, call the whole class into a Zoom meeting, and I say, okay, guys, I hope y'all are all ready for your big test coming up with the 10 essay questions and 30 ID terms. Everybody's going to look at me like, what the hell are you talking about? And they're going to be ready to tear me up into pieces, right? Because they didn't agree to no test. And I'll say, sure you did. Sure you did. I have this form here signed by one of your classmates saying that you all agreed to this. And that's kind of what would happen. Okay, people who had no authority to speak for their entire band or nation would be coerced into making these agreements, and then the entire band or nation would be held responsible and expected to get onto that reservation. Okay, so I think we can absolutely understand why there would be a lot of resentment growing here, both as a result of this treaty system and this mass extermination of bison, to which many of these Plains tribes have both a spiritual connection and a very heavy material dependence. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples of the types of reservations established in this post-Civil War period to get a feel for what I'm talking about here, and we can kind of see how things play out with individuals under these treaties and living on these types of reservations. So first, let's take a look at the Medicine Lodge Treaty. This established reservations for groups on the southern plains, okay, so down in the southwest, groups like the Comanches, in exchange for agreeing under this treaty to be moved onto reservations in Indian Territory, which was in Oklahoma. The U.S. government would regularly supply some food and rations to the people living on the reservation, okay, kind of the exact system we just talked about. You're set on this reservation. U.S. government's bringing you some supplies every now and then in return. And also, as we just talked about, in many cases, the agreed upon amount of rations and food and supplies would frequently fall short. All right, it was often less than promised. Furthermore, a lot of key leaders of the Comanches and these other groups who were expected to come move onto this reservation did not ever agree to the terms of this treaty, yet they're being expected to abide by it. This is kind of typical of the type of treaty and reservations we would see in this period. One that's a little different that I do want us to follow through with is the Treaty of Fort Laramie. This one established the Great Sioux Reservation. This applied to people like the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne nations out in the Black Hills. We need to understand the Black Hills was sacred to these peoples. There's stories of the Lakota Sioux arriving in the Black Hills around the same time that the independence movement was kicking off on the East Coast against the British Empire. So maybe that's their kind of founding American moment. But they see it as their sacred homeland where their people were truly born. And this treaty said that they could stay there on the Black Hills, all right, and that they could have the Black Hills and surrounding areas as a reservation. And in turn, the federal government agreed to keep U.S. settlers out of the Black Hills, all right. So the deal was, again, Lakota and Cheyenne get to stay in the Black Hills, this sacred space. No U.S. settlers were allowed onto the Black Hills, and the U.S. government would have officials that would come in sometimes, but they would keep all settlers, all miners, hunters, etc., out of the Black Hills. So it sounds like a pretty sweet deal as far as treaties and reservations go, right? They get to stay on their homeland, get left the hell alone. Well, unfortunately, it was pretty frequently violated, right? There were a lot of encroachers who would still come into the Black Hills, hunting, exploring, etc. And eventually there were rumors that some people were saying, hey, there's gold in those there hills. And as these rumors became more and more frequent, the U.S. Army led an expedition into the Black Hills. And sure enough, they discovered there was gold in the Black Hills. So that's going to lead to all kinds of problems, all right? From there, forget about it. All bets are off. Everybody and their mothers coming into the Black Hills. And we're going to see what this leads to with the U.S. Army. It's going to get pretty ugly. All right, so all this resentment growing among indigenous peoples in response to the shady agreements establishing reservations, those agreements often being violated with the U.S. government failing to own up to their terms of the agreement. This mass extermination of the buffalo is all again leading to very extreme resentment among individuals within many of these indigenous nations, seeing this happen to their people. And many of them responded to this with violent resistance. All right. And to give you an idea of what these people were feeling, I've provided you a quote here from a Cheyenne chief named Little Robe. He said, "Your people make big talk and sometimes make war if an Indian kills a white man's ox to keep his wife and children from starving. What do you think my people want to do when they see their cattle, the buffalo, killed by your race when they are not hungry?" Very extreme resentment there, driving people to put up some form of resistance, and many of them did try to resist through warfare. Okay, and we'll look at some examples there and see how that turns out. So, one example of Native American leader who used violence as a means of resistance was Quanah Parker. So, Quanah Parker was a Comanche chief, and we need to understand a little bit about the Comanches. I'll do my best to not get too carried away here for the sake of time. But the Comanches, some historians such as Pekka Hamalainen, have come to consider an empire of the Southern Plains. All right. In this book here, Pekka Hamalainen kind of sums up how the Comanches were this very powerful nation that dominated the Southern Plains for quite some time. I mean, he's kind of moved beyond this traditional view of the Comanches as being this savage barrier to imperial expansion into the Southwest. And says, no, the Comanches are people. They are a human society. So why are we looking at them differently than these other groups of people who are trying to push them out? They are their own empire, okay? They've expanded into this region and they've taken a kind of claim there, right? They're an unofficial sort of empire. Some historians are very skeptical of the use of this word empire, suggesting things such as the fact that there's no central ruler or emperor over the Comanches. Also, that they don't seem to have defined clear geographical boundaries anywhere on paper. I also have a colleague who's very hesitant to use that word empire because she's very wary about using words like that loosely and how that might turn out moving forward if we continue to use words loosely. And some of them may kind of lose their meaning and be misused in ways that cause more confusion than good as we study history. All right, whether or not you want to use that term empire, that's up to you. But we need to understand that regardless of what term we use to describe them, the Comanches were a very, very powerful nation who held expansive control over the Southern Plains. If we look at the way they built themselves up so powerfully, we do see perhaps a form of conquest. Okay, the Comanches started out as a very weak people. They were an offshoot of an indigenous nation known as the Shoshones, and they got basically kicked out of their homelands and they made their way down to the Southwest after they were exiled, and they decided to rebuild themselves as a people. And I want you to note that they did rebuild themselves around horses. Okay, that's pretty important. That sounds trivial, I know, but we'll see why that matters moving forward. They became very skilled with horses, and they had certain horse herds that they would use for riding, for things like raiding. They had other ones they would use as commodities to trade, and then they had other ones that they would use for warfare. They were very meticulous about what types of horses they had, what they used for what, and they basically came into the Southwest and they began absorbing other people into their culture, whether it was through establishing kinship networks through things like trade, or whether it was through carrying out raids and taking captives and having them join the Comanche Empire. But they built themselves, regardless, into this very strong group of people who dominated the Southern Plains for quite some time. Far beyond their brutal raids and warfare, Comanches were also very powerful in the sense that they had extensive trade, right? That they did form diplomatic type relationships with Europeans and other indigenous groups. All that there we need to keep in mind is the history, the background, the context of the Comanches leading up to this moment to where now, under the Treaty of Medicine Lodge, they're being confined to this reservation and put under the authority of the U.S. government. So they've gone from this very powerful empire who dominated the Southern Plains and are now being told you have to stay in this small space and wait around for us to bring you things like food and supplies to survive on. And Quanah Parker, as we might imagine, as a Comanche chief, was very frustrated with the conditions placed on Comanches under the Treaty of Medicine Lodge, taking away from their great past as a sort of empire, right? This very powerful people. And so he decided to respond to all of this through warfare. He also had some inspiration by an indigenous prophet who kind of helped guide him and help him see that his quest was to take down the buffalo hunters and other people who were putting his people in this weakened state. A clear example of a violent campaign carried out as a form of resistance to domestic imperialism from the U.S. was the Battle of Adobe Walls. So this started as a campaign led by Quanah Parker, and some other warriors against bison hunters at this trading post in North Texas called Adobe Walls. They were able to have some victories early on, but eventually the bison hunters were able to hold them off with their high-powered buffalo rifles. And what I really want us to understand about this Battle of Adobe Walls is that after Quanah Parker and his band attacked these buffalo hunters, they went and reported to the U.S. Army that there's this Comanche warrior out causing trouble, out attacking buffalo hunters, who was not on his reservation like he's supposed to be. And when they went and reported this to the U.S. Army, this led directly to another series of campaigns known as the Red River War. So during the Red River War, the U.S. Army and their Apache scouts, Apaches, by the way, were traditional enemies of the Comanches, worked together to hunt down Quanah Parker and his band, all right? And they were trying to force them onto the reservations. But they really struggled to track down Quanah Parker. So the Apache scouts came up with an idea. They convinced the U.S. Army, why don't we track down and kill their horses? So that's what they did. They ended up finding Comanche's horses and slaughtering them. There's definitely some important significance here we need to understand behind that decision to kill Comanche horses during this Red River War. On one hand, there's a very practical reason for this, okay? The Comanches and others who at this time were in Paladero Canyon are going to need those horses to navigate the region. And now they have no way of getting around. That's going to wear them down and probably make them eventually surrender. But furthermore, remember, as I was telling you about the growth of the Comanche into the powerful sort of empire that they became, I said that one way they really managed to become so powerful was through their expert use of horses, right? So Comanche horses were kind of the symbol of their power in a way. It was the horse that helped them become such a powerful people. So by killing Comanche's horses, the U.S. Army and their Apache scouts were symbolically also killing Comanche power, right? Kind of wearing down that symbol of this dominant empire who had wielded control over the southern plains for so long. Not long after this, Quanah Parker and his final warriors who had been out on the run were worn down enough that they eventually surrendered and turned themselves in at Fort Sill in Indian Territory. There's a legend that different animals guided Quanah Parker in the direction of Fort Sill, letting him know that eventually it was no longer sustainable to stay out here fighting, hiding, that he did eventually need to turn himself in. All right, very fascinating story, but overall, again, I want us to understand the Red River War was a clear example of violent resistance to U.S. domestic imperialism. Quanah Parker, all right, let's sum him up. He was a Comanche chief who led violent campaigns against buffalo hunters and the U.S. Army. We could say he's pretty historically significant because he's very clearly an example of indigenous leaders who used warfare or violence to resist incorporation and domestic imperialism. We could also say he's historically significant because he led the last major militant resistance to this domestic imperialism on the southern plains. As we'll see here shortly, there was still continued militant resistance in other parts of the plains. All right, so let's look now to a couple more examples of Native American leaders who used violence as a means to resist domestic imperialism and being incorporated into American society. Here I want to look at two leaders named Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. So these were two leaders of the individuals who were subject to the Fort Laramie Treaty, where they were granted the Black Hills and told that American settlers would stay off. Well, remember, that treaty was frequently violated, and once gold was discovered in the Black Hills, the U.S. government really wanted to get a hold of that gold. So they kind of went backsies on the Fort Laramie Treaty. They said, sure, we have this legally binding treaty saying that you have the right to this territory and we'll stay out and keep our people out. But actually, we really want it. So I'll tell you what, why don't you let us buy it from you? And the Lakota and the Cheyenne kind of scoffed. They said, no, we're not selling this for anything. This is our sacred homeland. Cannot put a dollar value on it. Furthermore, we've already made an agreement with you stating that we are protected to live here. So you stick to your end of the treaty, we'll stick to ours. The U.S. government did not like that response. So they gave the people living in the Black Hills an ultimatum. They told them that they either needed to vacate the Black Hills by a certain date, or they would be forced out of the Black Hills by the U.S. Army. And when the Army was coming to try to push people out of the Black Hills, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse here put up a force of resistance to defend the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne who were living in the Black Hills. The U.S. Army commander leading the charge on the Black Hills was a Civil War veteran, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. He was kind of a hothead. He thought a lot of himself, and he greatly underestimated the power of the indigenous forces. Custer had a bunch of indigenous scouts with him who tried to warn him, hey, these people really mean business. They're outnumbering you. They're serious about defending their sacred homeland. They said, maybe you should wait for some reinforcements to come back you up. Custer said, well, I don't need to wait on no reinforcements. It's just a bunch of Indians. They're no match for me. I'm a great Civil War officer. Can't nobody stop me. And he led this big, disastrous charge against Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse's forces at the Little Bighorn River. And this became known as the Battle of Little Bighorn. Sure enough, Custer should have listened to his Indian scouts. This was a disaster for him and for the entire 7th Cavalry. This battle ended in less than an hour. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse's forces were very determined, very skilled warriors, and they defeated Custer and his troops. And this has been portrayed in several different ways throughout American history, all right? There's also another common name for this battle, Custer's Last Stand, all right? And it gets portrayed as this valiant downfall of a great military commander of the U.S. Army trying to carry civilization out into the West, who was conquered by these brutal, savage Indian forces who surprise attacked him, when really he's the one who kind of started this whole shebang and didn't wait for reinforcements like his Indian scouts told him to. And that's also kind of leaves out the very important context of the fact that these people had every right to be here defending this land under the Fort Laramie Treaty. But that's the story that kind of got told to the American people, and that's the story that got carried out into newspapers at the time as well, convincing people that this was a very valiant downfall of an American commander trying to expand civilization out into the West. And this is all pretty historically significant because it led to further conflict between indigenous nations and the U.S. Army, and it also heightened American interest in the Indian Wars, okay? As people began hearing these stories of, as it got portrayed, this valiant military commander who was a Civil War general being defeated by brutal savages with uncivilized quote unquote names like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. People said, we really need to up our game in our wars against Native American resistance, and we really need to have more support from the U.S. Army out in the West. All right, but as these wars waged on, many Americans did eventually grow wary of the violence that it entailed, and other people began seeking more non-violent measures to incorporate indigenous people into the U.S. A clear example of people who had this train of thought was a military commander named Captain Richard Pratt. All right, Captain Richard Pratt was responsible for overseeing some Apache prisoners of war during the Indian Wars. And as he interacted with these Apache prisoners day in and day out, he noticed something very surprising about them. They were people, all right? They were fathers, they were brothers, they were soldiers, they were human beings with human experiences and human thoughts and human feelings, all right? And he started to suggest we need to find a way to continue to wash out this quote unquote savageness that he thought he recognized in indigenous peoples, but we should find a way to do so that maintains their humanity, okay, that does not threaten their life with brutal conflict. All right, before we move any further, I know this has been a very long lecture, so we'll go ahead and take a quick break here, let you guys have an intermission, and take some time to do a fun little lecture activity, a very easy one. All you're doing is making a list. You can do bullet points, you can do comma lists, I don't care. List it all out. Point out as many differences as you can between this image here and this image here. Then jump back on. All right, welcome back. Look at list going there. These are two very clearly different images. But, big shocker here, this is the same guy, all right? Same individual. This became Captain Richard Pratt's vision for incorporating Native Americans into American society and for, as he called it, killing the Indian to save the man, all right? One thing I do want to point out right quick is something that one of my mentors frequently drew my attention to. He said that in this late 1800, early 1900 period, which we call the Gilded Age, more on that next lecture, we have two groups of people, right? We have African Americans and Chinese people out on primarily in the West Coast, wanting very much to be a part of American society, but being excluded in many ways and told, no, you don't have what it takes to be within our society. By contrast, here, we have these indigenous peoples wanting to just be left the hell alone and live their traditional lifestyles, who are going to be now forcibly incorporated into American society. Very ironic. All right, but to incorporate them into American society and spare their humanity by, as he said, killing the Indian and saving the man, Captain Richard Pratt founded an Indian boarding school known as Carlisle Indian Industrial School. All right, so this is just one example of several Indian boarding schools that were open throughout the nation. And what these schools did is they forced a change of customs onto indigenous children. All right, they would basically recruit indigenous people's children into these schools. They would use similar types of tactics like they did to get people to agree to sign treaties for their reservations. They would convince them that it was in the best interest of their kids moving forward, that it would be safer for them there, and all this crap. And kind of coerce them into agreeing. And there's stories of mothers weeping and begging these people not to take their kids as they took them in some cases, but they take them and force them to do things like cut off their hair, which in many of these plains nations, the only time in which a person would cut their hair short was if they were either in a time of great mourning, as they'd lost somebody very close to them, or if they'd done something to disgrace themselves, all right, or to shame their people. So some of these kids now suddenly being brought to this place where they're really confused. They don't understand most of what people are telling them, forcefully getting their hair cut off. They're feeling as if they've brought some kind of shame somehow and they've done something wrong. Also forced to adopt different clothing. They were forbidden in many cases from speaking indigenous languages in these schools, could even face physical punishment for that. Several stories about that. And their religion as well. A big part of this was emphasizing Christianity, well, American versions of Christianity, that is, and expecting these students to adopt that as their religion. And Carlisle here really set the foundation, though, for other boarding schools around the country who would take on similar types of projects. And this is kind of the end result of a student who's gone through a full transformation at Carlisle. Some of the students here at Carlisle did find certain ways to resist what they were faced with. All right, they used things like sign language that they would create to get around not being able to speak their native languages. If they were forced to do labor and work, because that was a big part of it, having to learn the value of work, they would intentionally work slow, or, oh, silly me, I hurt myself, or silly me, I broke this tool. Guess I can't do quite as much work as quickly now. Unfortunately, in some cases, some of them went to much more extreme measures and did things like going on hunger strikes, refusing to eat. But later down the road, a lot of these students would take this harsh situation and use it as an opportunity to challenge unjust policies and defend indigenous people's traditional right with the knowledge they had. Okay, so for example, many of these individuals became lawyers who would put up legal defense for their native nations. Another pretty fascinating way that some students in Carlisle maintained their sense of agency was actually through football. A lot of the young men at Carlisle used football as a means to find their own way to kind of contribute, in a sense, to the larger Indian wars when they would play against teams like West Point, which was the military college, or big traditional American Ivy League schools. And their team, the Carlisle Indians, was coached by an individual named Glenn Scobie Pop Warner. Some of you guys have probably heard of Pop Warner football, which is junior level football. Well, who the hell is Pop Warner, right? Turns out he was at one time the coach for the Carlisle Indians, and he helped make them into this much more skilled team that actually made several contributions to modern football. I can't get too into the technicalities. I'm not much of a sports fan, so I don't know the difference here and there, but it is all written here in this great book that I strongly recommend to all of you. I was kind of hesitant about this book when I first was assigned it for a grad school class because, again, I'm not a big football fan, but it's a very easy read, very fascinating story that gets not only into the experience of football and the football team here, but really delves into the experience of students at Carlisle as well. Great book, go check it out. All right. Another nonviolent measure that the U.S. began to take by the later 1800s toward incorporating indigenous peoples into American society was the Dawes Severalty Act, also known as the General Allotment Act. So this act divided reservation lands and distributed the lands out to individual families. The goal here was to get these communally living nations of people to begin shifting to a more individualistic lifestyle, all right, by having private property. This also, again, was pressuring these nomadic hunting groups to even further than they were on the reservations, adopt more sedentary type lifestyles and adopt things like farming and buying food as their means of survival. Again, this is all more acceptable to this mainstream American culture that was developing as part of this new America that was being constructed after the Civil War. This is also absolutely, I would say, a very clear example of domestic imperialism at play, right? We see all kinds of American ideas being forcefully thrusted upon indigenous Plains people. So, after these lands under the Dawes Act were divided up and distributed out to these individual Native American families, there was usually a great deal of land left over. And the US government would auction off that land to US settlers. So, overall, pretty raw deal for the indigenous peoples involved. But just as we saw nonviolent measures of incorporation, there were also nonviolent measures of resistance. Right, so we're going to look at legal resistance and at spiritual resistance, as well as their impacts. So, a clear example of legal resistance, you should have reviewed some things on this by now for your reading video quiz, and seen that Chief Standing Bearer of the Ponca people tried to leave his reservation when his son died as a result of the hardships endured during the Ponca's trek to their reservation. He had lost a daughter along the way as well. But as his son was dying, he made one final request to his father, Standing Bear, to be buried on their sacred ancestral land, which they had been removed from as part of this domestic imperialism. And as Standing Bear was illegally with a delegation of people leaving his reservation to honor his son's dying wish and bury him at their homeland, he was captured by a military commander named General George Crook. And Crook heard Standing Bear's story, and he had a lot of sympathy for Standing Bear, right? And he said, "Look, I understand what you're going through here is unfair. And I think you and I both understand that there's a much bigger issue at play here than just your individual experience. There's a much larger injustice being played out against all indigenous people." And he helped Standing Bear organize a trial in which Standing Bear filed for a writ of habeas corpus, meaning he claimed that he was unlawfully being arrested and being detained, saying there was no real legitimate charges to be brought against him, so he needed to be released. And the court argued that no, Standing Bear was ineligible to make this claim, and the reason was that under the law, Native Americans were not recognized as people. Please don't mix this up and say this had anything to do with citizenship. This is not a matter of citizenship. This is a matter of humanity. Okay, most indigenous peoples in this time had no interest in being U.S. citizens. They wanted to be left the hell alone. This is a matter of these people not being recognized as people, okay? This right that people have of being able to file for that writ of habeas corpus is intended to be a universal right that all people, regardless of their citizenship status, should be able to file for in the U.S. But because Standing Bear was not considered a person in the eyes of the law, he was denied that right. But as you saw, Standing Bear was permitted to make a statement during his trial, and it was a very moving statement that swayed the judge and the courts to make a very important ruling here. All right. And he essentially said, "I am a man," all right, meaning I am a human being. Stop playing games with me. All right. If I cut my hand, I'm going to bleed the same blood that you would if you cut your hand. We both bleed the same blood because we are both human beings. So treat me like a human being. All right, basically what it came down to. And this was very historically significant, all right? This established legal recognition of Native Americans as people, all right, rather than just wards of the state. And as people, indigenous peoples were now subject to the same universal rights as all other people. Standing Bear took this one particular very devastating case of trying to bury his son on his homeland and made it into this greater case of having indigenous peoples recognized as human beings in the eyes of US law. Very astounding. There's a great book on this too, by the way, titled I Am a Man by an author named Joe Sarita. Again, very easy read, very well researched. I do recommend that to you as well. All right, final example we want to look at of nonviolent resistance is a form of spiritual resistance, okay, referred to as the ghost dance. The ghost dance was a Native American ritual or ceremony created by a Paiute medicine man named Wovoka that blended Christianity and traditional American Indian religions. And this was a dance that several Native American groups throughout the plains began to practice. They believed that through this dance, they would make US civilization fade away, and that they would reawaken their ancestors and reawaken the buffalo and bring a return to a traditional Native American way of life, right? They believed if enough people collectively participated in this dance, they could create a mass consciousness that can make all these things happen. Now, some people, of course, didn't maybe literally believe this. Some of them saw, okay, we're coming together and practicing traditional ceremonies together in a traditional way. And in that sense, we are awakening, metaphorically, the spirit of our ancestors and what they stood for. All right. Others saw it very literally that this dance would bring back the buffalo, bring back their ancestors, and expel US civilization from the plains. But when the US government got word of this, it scared the bleep out of them. Okay. We got to understand. All right. What the US government is seeing are all these groups of plains people, all different nations, gathering together out in the plains, performing this ceremony together, and they're hearing talk of the end of US civilization and the return of Native American rule over the land. And they're starting to imagine, shit, these people are forming a big uprising and they're going to try to kill us all. So they started taking measures to disarm a lot of Native American peoples. And let's see how that all turned out.
At the same time, the aging Hunkpapa Lakota leader Sitting Bull had been touring with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, where he was paid to ride around the arena once during each performance, promoted as the Slayer of General Custer. He also signed pictures of himself for the awestruck visitors who came to his teepee. But after 4 months with Cody, Sitting Bull had seen enough of the white world. He could not understand why beggars were ignored on the streets of big cities, and he gave much of his pay away to the hobos and newsboys he met. Back at the Standing Rock Reservation in Dakota Territory, he used the money he had left to provide feasts for his friends.
Some of this is very hard to put into words, but sometimes it'd be a certain amount of emptiness in a spot. You can have this emptiness and you can't identify it. It's only an emptiness, you know, and it's, maybe that would have been a part of it, but also we got a lot of things that are gone. That are gone.
In 1890, a summer drought killed whatever crops the Lakotas were trying to raise. The government had already cut rations at every reservation by more than 20%. Whooping cough and influenza spread among the hungry people, particularly the children. Then word arrived that a new ceremony called the Ghost Dance was sweeping through many tribes of the West. preached by a Paiute medicine man and combining Christian as well as Indian elements, it offered dispirited Native Americans hope.
My brothers, I bring you word from your fathers, the ghosts, that they are marching now to join you, led by the Messiah, who came once to live on earth with the white man, but was killed by them. I bring to you the promise of the day in which there will be no white man to lay his hand on the bridle of an Indian's horse, when the red man of the prairie will rule the world. Wovoka.
Wovoka's prophecy required men and women to purify themselves, give up alcohol, and forswear violence. Then they were to dance in a large circle, singing and calling upon the spirits of their ancestors. If they did, the ghost dancers believed, the whites would vanish, and the buffalo would cover the plains again. "Give me my arrows," they sang as they danced. "The buffalo are coming. The buffalo are coming." Though he lived in New York City, the naturalist and writer George Bird Grinnell spent parts of every year living among the Pawnee, Blackfeet, and Cheyenne, listening to their stories, studying their religion, learning their history. In the fall of 1890, he watched the Cheyenne hold a ghost dance. Grinnell understood the appeal of its message. "This is only what any of us will do," he wrote, "if we get hungry." In the Lakota's adaptation of the ceremony, ghost dancers wore special shirts, said to be impervious to the white man's bullets. Government agents became alarmed, fearing an uprising was imminent. As a precautionary measure, Indian police at the Standing Rock Reservation were ordered to arrest the most prominent Lakota chief, Sitting Bull. When some of his followers resisted, a fight broke out. Both sides began firing, and a dozen people were killed. Sitting Bull was one of them. Several hundred Lakotas, flying a white flag, headed toward the Black Hills and planned to turn themselves over to the U.S. Army to settle things peaceably before more blood was shed. They encamped one night at a creek called Wounded Knee. The next morning, December 29, 1890, soldiers armed with 4 devastating Hotchkiss guns encircled the camp and began confiscating the Indians' weapons. Someone's gun went off. The soldiers opened fire. When the shooting stopped, more than 250 Lakotas, most of them women and children, were dead. So were 25 soldiers.
What was they trying to do? They was trying to dance the ways back. They were praying. They tried to dance the buffalo back. And they paid with their lives.
The most shameful chapter of American history is that in which is recorded the account of our dealings with the Indians. The story of our government's relations with this race is an unbroken narrative of injustice, fraud, and robbery. We are too apt to forget that these people are humans like ourselves, that they are fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, men and women with emotions and passions like our own. George Bird Grinnell.
Okay, that is always a very, very moving video. To this day, I've seen it 100 times at this point, and it still gives me chills. A lot of things I want to point out in that video that normally if we were watching it together in class, I would have pointed out by now. One, Wovoka, the creator of the ghost dance, is very clearly influenced in many ways by this point. He kind of demonstrates to us that many Native Americans by this point were heavily influenced in a lot of ways by white American society. For one, his ideas of race, which this had begun much earlier. We see evidence of translations from indigenous peoples much earlier in American history using terms like red men and white men, showing that division of I am a red man and somehow that makes me different than a white man has been passed down onto indigenous peoples as well. And that's definitely something that seems to be continuing into Wovoka's time here. And I also like to point out that Wovoka refers to this white messiah who was killed by white men. All right. It's very clear that his ideas of Christianity have been passed on to him by white Americans, all right, who've likely showed him paintings of a white Jesus being crucified by other white people. And that's where he's formed this idea of what the Messiah, meaning Jesus, and the Christian religion is. Lastly, very important thing to point out. Right before the soldiers began firing onto the crowds of indigenous peoples here, many of whom were unarmed women, children, and elderly people, their justification was that somebody's gun mysteriously went off. In addition to my fascination with history, I had this kind of weird fascination with organized crime. So I watched all kinds of documentaries and interviews and videos and things about the mafia and other organized crime groups. And I have never heard of there being a gunfight or any kind of feud that started because a gun mysteriously just went off. Yet there's a few of those throughout American history where this gun just mysteriously goes off and it's almost inevitable at that point. They have to have this battle because for all they know, they're being shot at. But nobody knows who really fired that first shot or what really happened. Maybe this gun just went off. And it's always, you'll notice, episodes in history where there's involvement with either an American militia or the US military, that a gun just mysteriously goes off, and therefore there must be this inevitable conflict. Isn't that a little strange? Chew that one over for a while. Okay, so this very devastating conflict that occurred at Wounded Knee. We saw that the US Army, very well armed, had people with peaceful intentions, and while some of them clearly did choose, once the battle began, to stand up and fight and defend the people around them, several of these people who were killed by trained, well-armed professional soldiers here were children, women, and elderly people. And this all leads historians into this hot debate. Should this be considered a battle or a massacre? And I always like to ask my students after viewing that very moving video about this event, which do they think? Was this a massacre or a battle? Every semester so far, students are quick to say, this is a massacre. Okay. And I can absolutely see where we get that from. This is a very devastating event. Very, very sad considering the losses of so many unarmed people with peaceful intentions. But I personally consider it a battle. All right. And the reason for that is there were individuals among these Native Americans who were brave enough that when this gun apparently mysteriously went off, to pick up their own arms and defend their family members and defend their homeland and defend what they believed in. And I strongly advocate memorializing that bravery by considering this conflict to be a battle. But that is my historical interpretation, okay? That's how I understand and explain the evidence. You may understand and explain it differently. And as long as you're basing your interpretation on evidence, that's totally fine. That, my friends, is the beauty of studying history.